What's up, everyone? I'm Tanya Octave, and today I want to share with you something really special. I released a video about the 5 types of spiritual trauma that psychology doesn't recognize, and the response, it was pretty good. So many of you have reached out sharing your own experiences, and then I was asked, Tanya, this all makes sense, but what does healing actually look like? So today I want to answer that question by sharing the story of someone I'll call Sarah, a composite of several people I've worked with, created to protect confidentiality while showing you what's possible when we address spiritual trauma with the right approach. Sarah's journey represents the experiences of many people who found their way to my practice after feeling misunderstood by traditional therapy. What you're about to hear is the story of transformation, how someone went from healing spiritually broken and disconnected to reclaiming their authentic spiritual path and finding deep healing. This is what happens when we use an integrative approach that honors the mind, the body, and the spirit connection, and specifically when we apply with what I call the OCTAVES method. Before we dive in, I want you to know that if you see yourself in Sarah's story, healing is absolutely possible for you. Spiritual trauma is real, it is complex, and boy, it is also treatable. So when we use approaches that understand the full scope of what we are experiencing, so let's walk through Sarah's journey together, and I'll show you exactly how the Octaves method works to heal spiritual trauma from the spirit out. So let's begin. Sarah first contacted me after watching my video about spiritual trauma. She was 34 years old, a marketing professional, and on the surface, her life looked pretty good. She had a successful career, a loving partner, and what most people would consider a pretty stable life. But inside, Sarah was struggling with something she just couldn't quite name. In her initial email, she wrote, I watched your video about spiritual trauma and I cried for an hour. I finally have words for what I've been experiencing my whole life. I don't know if you could help me, but I'm desperate to feel whole again. When Sarah came to our first session, we shared her story with mixed relief and exhaustion. She had grown up in a strict evangelical household where questioning was discouraged and emotions were seen as a sign of spiritual weakness. Her natural sensitivity and intuitive gifts were labeled as dangerous and not of God. By the time she was a teenager, she had learned to shut down her spiritual experiences entirely. But the shutdown, it came at a cost. Sarah described feeling like she was living behind a glass, present in life, but not really connected to it. She had tried traditional therapy multiple times, but every therapist focused on her anxiety and depression without understanding the spiritual dimensions of her struggle. They would prescribe medication, maybe teach coping skills, and encourage her to just think more positively, but nothing addressed the deep spiritual wound that had been driving her symptoms. Sarah was dealing with multiple types of spiritual trauma simultaneously. She had religious institutional trauma from her childhood church experience, spiritual bypassing trauma from years of trying to pray away her depression, and what I recognize as sacred wound trauma. Her natural spiritual gifts had been so thoroughly rejected that she had lost trust in her own spiritual experiences. What struck me most about Sarah was her intelligence and her self-awareness. You see, she knew something was missing from her previous therapy experience, but she really couldn't articulate what. She would say things like, I feel there's this part of me that's been locked away, but I don't know how to get it back. This is kind of common with spiritual trauma. People know that that they aren't assessing their full selves, but they don't really have the framework to understand why. In that first session, I explained the OCTAVES method to Sarah. I told her that healing spiritual trauma requires a specific approach that addresses not just her thoughts and emotions, but her body, her energy, her ancestral patterns, and her relationship with the sacred. I could see the relief in her eyes when I said, your spiritual experiences are valid, and your sensitivity is a gift, not a problem. That's when Sarah's real, I'll say, healing journey began. Before I continue with Sarah's story, let me explain the OCTAVES method that guided our work together. This is a frame that I developed over years of working with spiritual trauma, actually all types of trauma, and addressing healing on multiple levels simultaneously. O stands for observation, creating safety and establishing trust, observing what is going on, both with me as a therapist and with the healing process itself. For spiritual trauma survivors, safety is just so paramount because their trust in spiritual authority has been violated, probably multiple times. And then there's C for compassion and clearing, identifying and releasing the energetic and emotional blocks that really keep people stuck in traumatic and trauma patterns. This includes both the psychological clearing and what I call maybe spiritual clearing, and there's practices that help support that. And then T is therapy, and a part of therapy is tracking, learning to track things like our sensations and emotions and energy in the body. Spiritual trauma often creates a disconnection from the body, so we need to rebuild that connection again. A stands for animals and playfulness and laughter, but there's this ancestral part, addressing the generational patterns of ancestral trauma that often underline spiritual wounding. We can't heal in isolation from our lineage. And V is victals, that nutrition and giving our body what it needs to in order to be the most alkaline it can be. A part of that is once you cleanse the body, the mind starts to purify and you start to have a different type of vision. And so it's really kind of learning how you can put things in place in alignment to reconnect with that authentic spiritual vision and purpose. This is about reclaiming those spiritual gifts and calling the trauma that may have been buried. E is for exercise and movement in a way that is embodying the integration, that healing into daily life and learning to live from a place of wholeness rather than woundedness. Reconnecting to the body, feeling the body, having that relationship. And then the S for socialize and building that relationship with yourself, that sacred relationship, learning how to have healthy relationships that are sacred, whatever that looks like for each person, because it'll be different. The OCTAVES method recognizes that spiritual trauma affects us on every level of our being, on the body, the mind, and the spirit. Then healing must address all of those dimensions. Traditional therapy often focuses maybe only on the mind, while spiritual approaches, they probably will ignore the psychological components. The OCTAVES method integrates both. Now, let me show you how this played out in Sarah's healing journey over the course of a year. The first major turning point for Sarah's healing came in about 6 weeks of our work together, during a time of what I'll call the opening phase. Up until this point, Sarah had been intellectually engaged in our session. When I could sense that she was holding back emotionally and spiritually. You see, we were working to create safety in her nervous system while things started to shift. I guided her through simple breathing practices designed to help her feel more grounded in her body. And as she breathed, I noticed tears just starting to flow down her cheeks. What's happening for you right now, Sarah? I would ask in a gentle way. Her response, I feel like I can breathe for the first time in years, with a little whisper. I didn't realize how much I'd been holding my breath. waiting for someone to tell me I'm doing spirituality wrong. This was the moment when Sarah's nervous system began to recognize that it was safe to have spiritual experiences again. For years, her body had been in a state of hypervigilance around anything spiritual because spirituality had become associated with danger, rejection, shame. We spent several sessions working on what I call spiritual safety. This involved helping Sarah understand that her spiritual experiences belong to her, not an external authority. We practiced simple breathing exercises, like feeling her feet on the ground and noticing her breath, while I repeatedly affirmed that her inner knowing was trustworthy. The breakthrough came, I'll say, when Sarah shared a dream she had. And in the dream, she was in a beautiful garden, and a voice told her, "You are safe to bloom here." And when she woke up, instead of dismissing the dreams as just her imagination, like she probably would have in the past, she felt curious about its meaning. I think my soul is trying to talk to me again. Ah, she said in our session. And for the first time, I'm not afraid to listen. Wow, this was huge. Sarah was beginning to trust her own spiritual experiences again, which is essential for healing spiritual trauma. Without this foundation of safety and trust, none of the deeper work could even be possible. During this phase, Sarah also began to understand how her childhood religious trauma had maybe created what I called spiritual hypervigilance. Her nervous system had learned to scan for spiritual danger constantly without keeping her in a state of chronic stress and disconnection. As we worked on creating safety, her anxiety levels began to decrease significantly. Sarah started keeping what I call a spiritual safety journal, where you can write down any spiritual experiences or intuitive hits she may have had, along with how her body felt when she was having them and experiencing them. This is the type of practice that helped her to rebuild the trust in her own spiritual perceptions as she's tracking the nervous system responses to spiritual stimuli. So by the end of this phase, Sarah reported feelings like, "I'm coming back to life." She was sleeping better. There was her anxiety had decreased, and she was beginning to feel even more curious about spiritual practices instead of fearful of them. So the second major turning point came around 4 months of our work during the clearing and tracking phases. Sarah had established enough safety to begin exploring the deeper layers of her spiritual trauma, and we were ready to address the energetic and emotional blocks that kept her stuck. We began working with what I call the trauma archaeology, where we are carefully excavating the layers and layers and layers of conditioning and wounding that really are accumulated over years and years. Sarah was ready to look at not just what had happened to her, but how it was living in her body and in her energy field. I'd say the breakthrough moment came during a session where we were working on a somatic technique that I use to help people track their energy in their body. I had guided Sarah to place her hands on her heart and simply notice what she felt there. Suddenly, Sarah's whole body, it began to shake. There was so much anger, she said, her voice filled with surprise. I'm so angry at them for taking my spirituality away from me. I'm angry at myself for letting them, and I'm angry at God for not protecting me. This was the first time Sarah had allowed herself to feel the full extent of her rage about her spiritual trauma. For years, she had been taught that anger was unspiritual, so she had to bury it deep, deep, deep down in her body. But that buried anger was creating chronic tension and fatigue and disconnection. So we spent several sessions working with Sarah's anger in a safe and contained way. I taught her that anger is often a healthy response to boundary violations, and that her anger about her spiritual trauma was completely valid. We used movement, breath work, and vocal expression to help her body release this stored anger. As Sarah learned to track and express her emotions, something beautiful began to happen. She started to feel more alive and more present and more connected to her own power. Statements like, I feel like I'm taking my space in my own life again. I feel like I'm living again, she told me. But the clearing work wasn't just about emotions. We also worked on what I call energetic clearing, helping Sarah identify and release the energetic imprints of her trauma. Sarah was naturally sensitive to energy, but her trauma had caused her to shut down this sensitivity because it just felt so overwhelming. So I taught Sarah, and we practiced techniques on how to protect her energy field and how to distinguish between her own emotions and energy and those that she was picking up from others. This was revolutionary for her. I always thought I was just anxious, she said. I didn't realize I was absorbing everyone else's stress. Wow. Wow. The tracking phase involved helping Sarah develop what I call spiritual body awareness, the ability to notice how different spiritual experiences are felt in the body. We practice with simple things like prayer, meditation, spending time in nature, with Sarah learning to track whether each practice felt nourishing or depleting. This phase culminated in a powerful session with Sarah, where she was able to distinguish between fear-based spiritual teachings of her childhood and her own authentic spiritual experiences. The fear feels tight and constricted in my chest, she observed. But when I connect with what feels true for me, there's this warmth, expansion feeling in my heart. But learning to track these subtle differences, Sarah was developing the discernment she needed to navigate her spiritual life safely and authentically. Then there's the third major turning point, came around probably month 7 when we moved into ancestral and visioning phases. Sarah had done enough clearing work that she was ready to explore even deeper patterns that had contributed to her spiritual trauma. So we began exploring Sarah's family history and discovered that her great grandmother had been a midwife and an herbalist, and she was forced to abandon her healing practices when the family converted to evangelical Christianity. Sarah's natural sensitivity and healing gifts were actually part of her ancestral lineage, but this knowledge had been lost when the family's spiritual practices were suppressed. No wonder I feel so conflicted about my intuitive abilities, Sarah realized. Part of me was trying to reclaim something that belonged to my lineage, but another part of me was terrified because I had been taught it was dangerous. So we did several sessions on ancestral healing work where Sarah was able to connect with the wisdom of her great grandmother and receive permission to reclaim her healing gifts. This work, whoa, this was profound healing for Sarah because it helped her to understand that her spiritual sensitivity wasn't a personal failing. It actually was an ancestral gift that had been suppressed by trauma. The visioning work involved helping Sarah reconnect with her authentic spiritual calling and her purpose. You know, for years, she had been so focused on avoiding spiritual mistakes that she had lost touch of what actually called her spiritually. Um, we use things like guided imagery. We definitely use dream work and creative expression to help Sarah really have access to her spiritual vision. The breakthrough came when Sarah had a powerful meditation experience where she saw herself as a bridge between ancient healing wisdoms and her ancestors and the modern world. I see myself helping other people who've been wounded spiritually, she shared with tears in her eyes. I want to create safe spaces for people to reclaim their spiritual gifts the way you've done this for me. The vision gave Sarah a sense of purpose that had been missing in her life. She began to understand that her spiritual trauma, even painful, had also given her a deep compassion for others who had been spiritually wounded. Her healing journey was preparing her to be a healer herself. So during this phase, Sarah also began exploring spiritual practices that felt authentic to her. Rather than trying to fit into someone else's spiritual framework, she was drawn to earthly based practices, energy healing, and meditation techniques that honored her sensitivity rather than trying to suppress it. For the first time in my life, I feel like I'm practicing spiritually instead of having spirituality practiced on me. Wow, Sarah told me. This shift from passive recipient to active participant in her spiritual life was a crucial part of her healing. You know, Sarah also began setting boundaries with family members who continued to judge her for her spiritual choices. She learned to stay connected to her love for them, but not allowing their fear based beliefs to derail her from her healing journey. And then there's the fourth and maybe final, but maybe not final turning point, but at least around 10 months. This was the embodiment and the sacred phases. Sarah had done the deep healing work, reconnected with her ancestral gifts, and even clarified her spiritual vision. Now it was time to integrate all of this healing into her daily life and rebuild her relationship with the sacred. The embodiment work involved helping Sarah learn to live from this healed place rather than this wounded place. Now, this may sound simple, but it's actually the most challenging one of all the aspects of the healing spiritual trauma. After years of operating from fear and disconnection, really learning to trust and operate from wholeness requires practice, patience, compassion, love, forgiveness. We worked on what I call spiritual confidence. Sarah's ability to trust her spiritual experiences and act on her intuitive guidance. She started making decisions based on what felt aligned rather than what she thought she should do. She changed her diet, to foods that felt nourishing, rearranged her living space to feel more sacred, and began incorporating daily spiritual practices that fed her soul. The breakthrough in this phase came when Sarah decided to leave her marketing job to train as an energy healer. This decision required her to trust her spiritual vision and act on it, despite the fear and maybe even a little anxiety that she needed with that extra push of uncertainty as it started to come up. She would say things like, 6 months ago, I would have never talked myself out of this. I would have convinced myself that it was impractical or that I wasn't qualified. But now I can feel in my body that this is the right path for me. You see, the sacred relationship work involved helping Sarah rebuild the connection with the divine in a way that feels safe and authentic. For years, Sarah's relationship with God had been, mediated through these fear-based religious teachings. Now she was learning to have a direct personal relationship with the sacred. We explore different ways of connecting with the divine through nature, through meditation, through creative expression, through service to others. Sarah discovered that she felt most connected to the sacred when she was in nature and when she was using her healing gifts to help others. I used to think God was a distant, judgmental figure who was always watching to see if I messed up, Sarah reflected. Now I experience the divine as a loving presence that's always supporting my highest good. It's like coming home to myself. The final session of a year together was incredibly moving. Sarah had transformed from someone who had disconnected from her spiritual nature to someone who was confident living her spiritual calling. She had enrolled in energy healing trainings, was in a healthy romantic relationship with someone who supported her spiritual growth, and had rebuilt relationships with family members from a place of strength rather than fear. I feel like I've reclaimed my soul, Sarah told me, not just parts that were wounded, but parts of myself that I didn't even know existed. And boy, I'm living the life I couldn't have imagined years ago. As I'm recording this video, it's been, years since Sarah and I completed our intensive work together. She even checks in on me occasionally, and I'm amazed of how continued growth still happens and how people are still transforming. You know, Sarah, she's an energy healer in her own practice, specializing in working with people who have spiritual trauma. She's become a powerful advocate for trauma-informed spirituality, creating workshops for other healers on how to safely work with spiritually wounded gifts. But more than her, let's say, professional success, is what moves me most about Sarah and the Sarahs out there is how to reclaim your joy and authenticity. Recently, I've seen videos and photos from a retreat that was being held, and I can see the radiance in a face, a smile of happiness, how you can just live in alignment with your true purpose. Sarah's relationship with her family, it's also transformed. While those don't always understand her spiritual path, they can see how much happier and healthier she is. Her mother making statements like, I just don't understand what you do, but I can see that you are glowing from the inside out. Sarah is also in a committed relationship with a partner who kind of celebrates her spiritual gifts rather than fearing them. I never thought I could be with someone who truly sees and appreciates all of me, statements she would make. But healing my spiritual trauma opened me up to receiving love in ways I didn't even know possible. Perhaps more importantly, Sarah has developed what I call spiritual resilience, the ability to navigate these spiritual challenges without losing her center. When she encounters people or situations that might trigger old spiritual patterns, she has the tools and the awareness to stay grounded in her own truth. I'm not afraid of my sensitivity anymore, she told me. I know how to protect my energy. I trust my intuition, and I'm not looking for external validation of my spiritual experiences. I know who I am and what I'm called to do. Wow. This is what healing spiritual trauma looks like. It's not just about feeling better, it's about reclaiming your authentic spiritual nature and living from a place of wholeness and power. You see, Sarah's story is just one example of what's possible when we address spiritual trauma with the right approach. The OCTAVE method works to recognize that spiritual trauma affects every level of our being. And healing must address all of these dimensions. If you see yourself in Sarah's story, I want you to know that this level of transformation, it is possible for you too. Spiritual trauma is real. It's complex, and boy, it is also healable when we use approaches that understand the full scope of what we're experiencing. Your spiritual wounds, they don't define you, but healing them can transform not just your spiritual life, but really every aspect of your existence. So when you reclaim your authentic spiritual nature, you know you reclaim your power, your purpose, and your joy. So, if you're ready to begin your own healing journey, I'm here to support you. I do give you and offer free consultation calls to where we can explore the OCTAVES method and see if this might be right for you at the right time. Remember, you deserve to feel whole, you deserve to trust your spiritual experiences, and you deserve support that understands all the dimensions of your healing journey, the body, the mind, and the spirit. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for watching. And I'll see you in the next video because I'm still going to dive deeper into all of these phases. Until then, trust your own healing wisdom and that be gentle with yourself.